So Home Movies is probably not a cartoon that's thought of when one wants to describe the concept of the bigger picture. It's known as this early Adult Swim cartoon you'd see in the middle of the night, improvising its little heart out and not much else. It's looked at rather fondly, but I don't think many understand or see this show beyond the first season or so. People generally don't understand how hard this series went. It grew through a full growth cycle in a way. When I went to rewatch it, I wasn't looking to espouse some deeper meaning from it. I just wanted to remember that finale. That said, I think it'd actually be beneficial for people to remember how well everything was set up from start to finish. So, that's what we're looking at today. Of course, since I couldn't just focus on that one episode, and since I really love home movies anyway, I figured it wouldn't hurt to parse through the rest of the show and look back on what made it so iconic in the first place. It's plain to see going through so much material, but I didn't know if everyone understands this show as well as I do now, so we're starting from the very beginning.
Apple is like a ship with a hole in the bottom, leaking water. And my job is to get the ship pointed in the right direction.
Have you ever seen the end of the animated movie Plague Dogs, where after being hunted down endlessly for days as dangers to the state, the two protagonists find themselves helplessly plunging into the English Channel, treading water to buy time, schlepping into the great white abyss ahead? That's basically how home movies started out. As you may know, the circumstances behind it kind of lined up well after having such a rocky takeoff, which enabled the series to grow steadily from where it started. The first season was split up into two parts, the first 5 half hours being part of UPN's episode order, and the additional 8 being first of the Adult Swim run. The first episode of the latter batch was actually the first program that ever aired on Adult Swim.
Ah, now that's funny.
Home movies. Name's McGurk, and soccer's the game.
So despite its cult status, its history and accompanying documentation seems to reflect it to be a bigger phenomenon than Express. Both parts of Season 1 can tell you so much off the bat, it's difficult to know where to start, though the theming around uncertain beginnings is kind of an accidental motif throughout. Right from the first episode, it screams unpolished, ethereal, and raw. One thing I noticed between the premiere and the rest of the season was the bolder visuals. The lines seemed thicker, the colors looked darker, the squiggle vision worked squigglier. The results seemed more unsure and submissive than the main director himself, which seems to be a far, far cry from how UPN decided to sell the show.
If Brendan Small is so smart, that boy's a genius, then why is he failing 4th grade? I have not done homework for the last year.
It's the kind of presentational whiplash that would have critics snarkily rebuking that sleeper hit of the spring quote for eons. By the second episode, the series seems to be a bit less shaky, but to the audience, its abnormal attributes made every episode appear to be as weird as the first. These traits were accurate reflections of the team's process and their experimental qualities, but plenty of these choices intentionally factored into the work and how it came to be accepted, begrudgingly or otherwise. Home Movie's most iconic aspect would have to be its improvised dialogue.
I have a cheese cow on my arm, Brendan. Don't get a tattoo. That's what I'm telling you.
Okay.
Play soccer. Brendan, take a look at my chest.
That's the bread and butter everyone recognizes it for, whether funneled into the dynamic of those unchecked screeds behind the camera, or afternoon exchanges between Brendan and McGurk. These conversations were a product of a retroscripted premise. Retrofitting is kind of like having a board-driven show, where the artist's visual or voiceover get more influence over the nitty-gritty details of the story. In Season 1, every episode had its scenes outlined sequentially, but the course of each was driven by the improvised dialogue. They could veer off into wild directions, but the next scene would essentially reset and place the story back on track. Not to say there was much to shift back on the rails in the first place, but I digress. This would seem perhaps like a stressful or counterintuitive system to go by to the rest of us, but for these guys, it worked on multiple levels. Every voice actor themselves had a natural synergy with the other actors, even if it didn't exactly seem like it all the time. The production crew was still discovering what the characters were as they were learning how to respond to them in many situations. Even in the midst of such challenges, a lot of exchange managed to stay relatively punchy and sharp.
That's not the way it's going.
Yeah, it's the way it's gonna be, isn't it? Yeah.
You know, Brendan, I know what you're doing.
You know how to hold a child? Have you ever held a baby and had it look at you like it really loves you?
It's funny because starting out, they auditioned a bunch of older character actors to fill out the cast. Though in the back pocket, their ragtag group of assorted comics and creatives was always enough to sell the experience. The way that scenes were edited had a pretty variable effect on these proceedings, too. There were plenty of times when the shtick went on for too long and it necessitated an abrupt cutaway, and there were others that seemed tightened up so as to give the timing some extra emphasis.
That's all. I'm not going to put them on my nose if that's what you're thinking. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
You're wrong. I'm not.
All right. You don't mind if I take them then? I'm just gonna take them.
Just take them.
All right, I
Just
will.
take 'em.
I will.
Nope.
I'll take them.
Leave two.
Cinematic editing for what's essentially seen as a glorified slideshow radio drama is one hell of a drug. Though if you look at the process for audio editing a bit closer, you start to understand how it helped round everything else out. These elements were exacerbated by the loose plotting of the season, which seemed to treat its episodes as little vignettes in the characters' lives rather than realized stories. You can tell that they were really loose because sometimes the movies didn't even relate to the plot yet.
Oh, no screaming help is gonna help! Scream all you want, baby, because help! Alright, stop screaming now.
Circling back to how UPN chose to envision what home movies would be, you could argue that it would perhaps be overshadowed by its own aspirations of establishing its own brand of animation domination, like most networks giving cartoons a side eye after The Simpsons popped off would. Gee, they have one somewhat successful outing with comic strips, and suddenly they want to take on the world.
And then I remember UPN flew her out, and we did like some kind of like a electronic press kit, right? So she came out and they filmed
It's a party for Dilbert. It had an ice sculpture of Dilbert. Which, if you've ever seen that, you know what waste is all about.
Home movies' mixed perception probably fueled its dry wit well into the show's lifespan. Its outward presentation was always its most celebrated and contentious point twofold. When I say that they were figuring out these characters, I mean all across the board. To this day, after combing through a shit ton of special footage and interviews, I still don't know the extent of Paula Poundstone's involvement. They've said plenty of her time there, but something tells me that they're holding some key info back. One day they're talking about time constraints, another time they're talking about creative stylings, and yet another they're just discussing how damn scary she could be.
Brendan, I'm gonna want to talk to you in a minute.
I'm going.
Though I suppose they probably weren't too spooked. I mean, considering she was the primary inspiration for her character's evolution, should we say, in the second season.
Could you do me a favor and just take out the recycling when you leave?
Show enough.
Great.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mom.
Everything's great.
Anyway, these characters seem more simplistic than they actually were, whether in execution or in concept. Brendan in particular went through many periods of transition. There were a lot of interesting quirks and side notes integrated into his character acting. And while the crew figured out how dry or expressive he was allowed to respond, they were still figuring out how animated their visual style could be.
I always thought it'd be great that, depending on his excitement, his nose would either be very, very pointy or very just kind of like, nah, I'm not happy about that. Yeah, we're just a little, you know.
Other character angles aside, the animation was one aspect of the show that had nowhere to go but up. Obviously, squiggle vision was highly divisive.
The reviews came out, and I remember reading
What do you
a good amount of them, and like they were so across the board. But even the people that did like it, they were like, I cannot watch the squiggling.
Yes,
I want so badly to like the show, but the squiggling makes me nauseous. I'm having epileptic seizures because of squiggling.
It was not only a staple of the studio that birthed it, but it defined the cartoons home movies preceded, like Science Court or Dr. Katz. When the practice was retired on the show proper, it continued to be employed on other studio projects like Hey Moni, with little to no pushback. Personally, I think home movies has always been more perky than people gave it credit for, squiggle or no squiggle. And crude constructions and muted bright palette aside, there was enough life in the posing to give the early visuals some spice. The techniques usually limited the degree of fluid motion one could execute, but the animators still managed to do plenty of cool stuff within those boundaries. Like animated slideshow quips aside, it's got a lot of great background gags off in that first season alone.
What I will do here is observe the cat for 24 to 48 hours to see if he is rabid.
Doctor?
Yes, Brendan.
I want you to take me too.
I kind of described the initial time on the project as a point where everyone tread water, which is as dramatic as it is visually striking, but probably not too far off from the mark. No matter the amount of press it may have gotten early on, the show premiered to some of the lowest ratings around. While UPN gave it a fair amount of time to pick up, they were not shy about the arrangement not working out, hence that 5-8 episode schism. It was out as soon as it was in, and for better or for worse, it could have concluded right then and there. Then suddenly, the series had found a friend in then Cartoon Network executive Wacky Jones.
Mary Catherine Tucker and Khaki Jones got together.
Bless them.
Khaki Jones is the reason we are here today.
Exactly.
There's no question about it.
Bringing the series over to Adult Swim was a cakewalk and legally nothing more than a passing thought. Not only was the show free to be picked up wholesale, but its expeditious 3 to 4 week turnaround from script to animation made it a perfect fit for the low-budget, highly conceptual vibe Adult Swim wanted to give off. The crew constantly talk about how chill and supportive Cartoon Network was throughout the process, whether out of an earnest desire to nurture the show or serendipitous neglect.
I have to say that Cartoon Network was amazingly nice about every kind of weird decision that we
They're very
kind of came
supportive.
up with.
Yes, the second season was like our adolescence, and they like stood by us
They
through our
nurtured us.
adolescence. They let us be who we were.
Yes.
They
They
knew
were-
we would
Let us
find
experiment.
ourselves.
Like, they let us go and hurt ourselves
Yeah,
too. You know.
and yet
yeah.
we were also awkward and embarrassing to be around.
Yes.
Like good adolescents.
So, for that time being, they couldn't say that they had discovered dry land, but at least they had some pieces of driftwood keeping them afloat. Creatively speaking, the show was regaining its footing by later changing aspects that had actually earned Kaki's favor in the first place.
So Khaki Jones was a big fan of the show, and the things that she liked about the show were, let's say, the things that I felt like changing. Just like how childish it was.
These traits are more evident in the season 1 finale, Brendan's Choice, where through a significant tonal shift and the looming presence of a new character throughout, made the series more alluring than ever by the end of it all. Now, part of why this series caught Jones's attention in the first place was its willingness to be a bit demure or unpleasant at times. In her words, it was a perfect representation of childhood, which was something Cartoon Network was looking for in some form. Whether she felt the vibe through the adult comics indulging in playful exchanges, or the cynical depiction of a world that portrayed adolescence as a constant pursuit of Dumb and Dumber, probably didn't matter. The motif was needed within the network at large, and home movies was worthy of adoption because it encapsulated this vibe perfectly. I'd say that Cartoon Network was a good parent, but to this day, their parenting methodologies are shrouded in mystery. Despite its successful transition into the Turner family, the home movies had yet another hurdle to surpass. See, Cartoon Network's contract stipulated they're allowed a stupid amount of time to determine if the show would get another season. The length of time changes every time it's brought up, but 2 to 3 years seems most accurate to this time frame. This last order, final episode included, was received warmly, but it had yet to prove itself as an abject success. So, at the end of the day, the show was still left floating in the water, even when that second season order came.
I'm glad you asked about that thing, 'cause what I'd like to do is sing. Oh man, I failed, didn't I?
Well, not so fast there, little mister. Why don't you take a look first?
I got an F?
Congratulations!
So Home Movie Surprise acquisition by Adult Swim illuminated the future possibilities afoot. Everything about the first season, even during those last 8 episodes, was quite touch and go. Not only did the series have a really tight turnaround, but the nature of the show required a constant re-examination of what everything was. No matter how niche, the move under Cartoon Network did stabilize the inner workings. The higher-ups had a responsibility to deliver some cool content, but moreover, they were mainly nerds who were just big fans of the show. The only tenuous aspect of their working relationship with the crew came when changing or reworking parts of the show that had previously won them over. Not to say the crew were a stereotypical band of starving artists feeding off the gritty integrity of their work, but their creative philosophies were fascinating for the industry they were a part of.
I got really excited about working with the actors, about editing the dialogue in audio, and just doing that, as much of that stuff as possible. There wasn't much writing back then, but I knew I was interested in that. Tom Snyder had really a lot of vision about how to use actors and how to use editors. And the trick was to find great people who liked to improvise and who were just really sort of warm and likable in front of a microphone. And to find young kids like me who would just do any amount of editing. Like if somebody talked for 5 hours, that was no problem. I would happily comb through it all and listen to all of it and try to figure out what the best takes were and the best half takes and glue them together. It was just a really, it was and is a great system for doing animation, because I think you build it around these performers who can, go and go and go and go and go.
Most, if not all, of the commentaries and extra features I got to look at were created post-Home Movies, a relatively short time after Season 4 finished airing, at the very least. So everything said and relayed in these conversations are overwhelmingly reflective of everything that they've done. A common thread that's brought up throughout is the pursuit of creative changes. Brendan pushed the show into a multi-episode arc, the updated animation style, the hard scripting, and so on. Though these changes by themselves were received rather neutrally at first, there was one aspect we'll touch on in a bit that tended to continually show its stripes. Financially speaking, the crew had a chance to pursue whatever they pleased, even if they wouldn't make bank off the final result. However, they did have to grapple with the public reception to some tweaks and changes.
Okay, do you still do the improv?
Yes.
Like every time though?
Yes.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Because I thought you didn't do it. Because it got a little bit worse, I'm not making fun of you.
No, what? Just explain worse.
Well, it wasn't funny sometimes. Like in the first season, it was always funny.
I don't think that the audience expected the exact same thing every time, but obviously there are things you'd associate with the show at the time that you wouldn't want altered. I think a lot of people that use the word formulaic are actually confused about its meaning, right? The term itself is kind of a softer way of deeming something predictable or patterned, but a formulaic structure takes many forms in animation. In preschool programming, it usually points to a storyline equipped with a few hard and fast rituals to follow throughout. Not only does this create a pattern of fluidity and consistency to expect, but the repetition to come from it makes it easier for the target audience to learn.
Say, will you help us get Izzy's hipster twister hoop back? Great!
In stuff like Phineas and Ferb, there's a pretty concrete structure followed in most episodes, but the enjoyment comes from subverting expectations by gradually, subtly tweaking the formula.
Barry the Platypus, what an unexpected surprise. And by unexpected, I mean completely
expected!
In home movies, there were certainly main destinations and staples, but a sense of a formulaic element, especially from season 1, was deceptively absent. Yet, while not having such a dramatic position in the story, pattern elements of such would play a larger role in shaping a concept much more vital to the story of home movies. In season 2, characters are key. It's much easier to slip into a conversation about these people since they've been more or less figured out since their initial appearances. This confidence to tackle these guys comes out in basically every part of the expansion, from the new recurring characters to the new development that returning characters take on later. You may have noticed this already, but by this point it seems like the pacing is finally starting to take shape. Everyone's moving faster and certain jokes hit like lightning.
You're seeing someone? You didn't tell me you were seeing someone.
Oh, sure. He's a cute little fella by the name of Mr. Television. Ever heard of him?
Milton Berle?
Brendan.
Mom, he's so old.
The spirit of the show has very much been kept intact, but what you can't see is the presence of actual writing. That's right, we've got scripts now.
Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god!
This is the first season where fully plotted scripts were created for each record. They were made as a fallback for lack of improvisation, but it's hard to count its influence in the show's tight progression. This must have been a hard decision, but I can tell you for free it was not studio imposed. Bill Broaddus and Brendan Small really cracked that whip structurally, which you can kinda see come out in the editing. It almost feels like there's way too much packed into one scene. The comedic timing can absolutely filibuster the rest of the story, but it doesn't feel like it halts the progression. Sometimes those older, more abrupt cuts that were just there now feed into more wild scenes and interactions. Particularly strong zingers or visual identifiers now close out other scenes. The visual composition can also take on some superseding interaction.
We promise!
It's a nice room you got here.
Atmospherically speaking, the world occupies a weird energy now. Well, weirder than it normally is anyway. Like the first season, as dry as it was, generally occupied a slow and methodical state of mind. Things just happened at their own pace, and even at their more volatile, everything's still plodding along and clunky. It'll take some time for a good joke to land in you, if at all. Comparatively speaking, the first season's like carting an old lame dog around a track of a sporting championship racehorse in its prime. I know this might sound like a crock of shit, but that's not really a bad thing. This is a natural evolution that resulted in not only understanding how to navigate certain characters and situations, but how to navigate the series' evolution itself. As you'll recall from the last bit, Adult Swim gave themselves a bunch of time to renew. Time that it surely did not use. In between the Season 1 finale and the Season 2 premiere, it was just shy of 3 months to prep that new season. Again, given that impressive turnaround paired with the smaller seasonal orders, it was not much of a stretch to accomplish. Despite what they may have said, the crew's dry snark didn't deflect them improving upon what they had built up. Away from the allure of chintzy ice sculptures and smarmy promotional materials, there was a groove to be found at Cartoon Network. Aside from the series' strong support upstairs, there was a sense of stability there. Brendan was set to change virtually everything that endeared Cack in his show in the first place, and insistent nudging aside, nothing was done about it. This seems like a minute point of non-interest, but this is not a detail to be forgotten. Home movies started to rev its engines from this point onward, and it really grasped its opportunities as a primetime cartoon. Literally everything got a level up. Even the storyboards, which were purposely rushed to be as crappy as possible to get to the action sooner initially, actually got to flesh out sequences of interest. This got bigger over time, and when funneled into the story and characters, it made for one hell of an episode. Characteristically speaking, home movies as a concept took remarkable shape. The writing showed off its ambitious goals, not necessarily through its new narrative structure, but rather through the creative kind of hell they put the mainstays through. Of course, it was done with much affection, but with no hesitation. all the same. The pacing necessitates the addition of a more streamlined story structure, resolutions or otherwise, rather than the extended play of vignettes utilized earlier. These stories set the characters up for prime arcs. It's not surprising how much Brendan goes through, considering that he's the decided focus of the series, but I'm still impressed with how much they decided to throw at him. This script has obviously integrated numerous notes from the commentaries and other special features, but they were especially helpful coming from the reflective standpoint they do. See, I've kind of interpreted his reflection to be more simpering and meek than he actually is. For his lack of presentation, he's actually more adjusted than most give him credit for. Through the lens of Bouchard and the main crew, the show, more simplistically, is centered around Brendan's movies and how he reacts to the world around him. The thesis for the show being set into motion lies with the acquisition of the camera, and despite it remaining part of the background action at best later, the movies it produces get all the credit. In this season, Brendan encounters two major characters that lead his revolving character arc. Cynthia, the unrequited object of his affections, and Andrew, his father, a new source of discovery for him. In an astonishingly brief number of episodes, they managed to capture the epic rise and fall of this kid trying to manage his home life and his interpersonal time outside of his inner circle. These two spheres of his life are like opposite arms of the same scale trying to align with a rickety beam that in the end just collapses in on itself. No, it wasn't because of the movies, but at the end of the day, they're still there for him, no matter what. The recurrence of the movies acts as a barometer for character development. So long as they stay in status and keep being made, they have yet to see any radical changes. For as many things as they'll introduce, the status quo always wins in the end. If anything, as things slowly fall apart around the kid, the movies, initially, gain more prominence. They start to mirror his life and his experiences. They help carry the directing theme throughout. They're part of the plot. They drive the plot now. They're not a facet of Brendan, but the movies loom over him as of late. You can't exactly say they were a crutch either, but they are basically the only stable part of his life. Brendan's main thread we follow involves him trying to break out into a leadership role. For a seemingly infinite amount of time, he'd only served to control a small portion of his life through his work. Out in the field, while he was built to be more socially mature than kids normally are, he's still flapping in the wind. It's his prerogative to find his footing, for which he unflappably fails to gain throughout Season 2. He certainly has the potential to show leadership skills, but when he flounders hard. It also doesn't help that he's still like an 8-year-old. His story gets bigger, and during this new season, he ramps up production on both his outside relationships and his movies, and everything seems to flounder in different ways. The 11th episode of the season, Writer's Block, encapsulates that nascent feeling of his racing mind not being able to cop to anything. Then, in a stunning twist of cosmic irony, the main trio still manages to put something together that probably mirrors how most people see this show in all of its illusionary, spontaneous brilliance.
I'm a wild ride!
The start of his character arc leads by example. See, every character goes through growing pains from this point onward. Once the team figured out the characters they made, it was touch and go from there. Jason develops a clingy personality and a penchant for gambling, in addition to a particularly crippling addiction to sugar. Melissa goes through insecurities about her position within the group and lashes out at points. Paula doesn't become an alcoholic, but she finds a reason to live out her innermost desires. McGurk is McGurk. Enough said, basically. The newer characters also experience some sort of one-sided development. Andrew and Linda flex their supreme relational skills for all the world to see. Fenton largely gets put in his place, but doesn't fail to be the annoying little turd that he was originally crafted to be. It's beautiful. Walter and Perry start to show more of their true colors. Clearly, everyone wins. These changes and adaptations did not make for a new smash hit, but they clearly did build on what was already there, and audiences didn't seem to mind. For now, they've found solid ground to work off, but their foundation is still a bit shaky. It's sufficiently done its job, so amidst the cavalcade of comedy, what's left to do than foster its growth with another seasonal order?
Two men did meet in a forest by the brook, and that day would change the fates of these two very famous men.
The third season is the definition of riding high. By many, it's considered the series' peak, and not necessarily in ratings, so to be honest, that probably wouldn't be that far off from the rest of the show. By this point, the show had the adulation and respect of critics and audiences twofold, and it got to experiment with new styles of storytelling, and the staff were having a lot of fun doing it. Now, it was time to kick it up a notch and really stake its claim. No season matches this high-energy, fast and loose manner of chaos this one reached. And if there was any episode that encapsulates the best of it, it's the Season 3 premiere, known as none other than Shore Leave.
Alright, walkie-talkie test. Let's see if these babies work.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can anybody hear me? I repeat, hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
By any other standards in TV animation, this episode is probably just an above-average romp into the reference-heavy comedy its genre is known for, if that. That said, anyone who had seen a portion of the show prior can easily recognize what an accomplishment this was. A lot of risks were taken to tighten this one from the times before, and it all comes to a head here. This title is such a tease, it's barely relevant past the first 2 minutes or so. Shore Leave is a comedy of errors that zeroes in squarely on its central protagonist. Our trio is roped into other activities, and the following weekend turns out to be one of the most high-octane experiences of their young lives.
It happens now as an adult where you do the equivalent of getting set up on a date with one of your friends that you don't like at all.
that's.
We have to hang out with somebody, but it's even worse when you're trapped.
Honestly, I don't want to say much more than that, other than the mild spoilage to absorb through these clips. You gotta go in blind to really feel the experience. That initial sequence from earlier adequately sets the scene. The first 2/3 play out like your average home movie episode. Quite unexpectedly, a lot of smaller details factor into the first 5 minutes or so. The animation obviously received another bump in between seasons. The small bits of character acting has always been strong throughout, but the increase in actual movement arcs and unique frames make it stick out all the more. It's the kind of nuance that makes it look more in line with Soup to Nuts' later work than not. The timing is also spot on. As the visual stylings got more complex, the timing had to step up to the plate to match, and needless to say, it hits it right out of the park. The commentators of this track really like talking about this one sequence with the Fairy Princess informational film, and it's really easy to see why. It looks like a throwaway gag, but it exemplifies how far the show has come visually. Anyway, characteristically, it's an atom bomb of flavor. The whole episode cribs off of putting people in really uncomfortable situations and seeing how they'll react when they're fully backed up against a wall. Jason doesn't even have a main role, but even he would apply to this in some respect.
This is Jason. I can't come through the walkie-talkie right now. If you'd like to leave a message, please do so after all the beeps.
Jason?
Beep. Boop.
See, everyone being oblivious gets the main kids in tricky situations. Like it's just for a weekend, but shit has been seriously dragging, and the meandering pace of the episode makes the mood extra fucked up by the third act. There is no hope, no escape, and no respite or hint of relief in sight. Then all of a sudden, the flamenco music kicks in. This whole beautiful sequence clocks in at less than 90 seconds, but it is a pure, bona fide expression of literal escapism. It is freaking epic. It is not a masterful solution to a mystery, nor a lovingly passionate romantic endeavor, nor a bittersweet final breath from a tragicomedy. It is pure chaos.
Over now.
While it definitely seems like an unorthodox premise, the season premiere is probably remembered as one of home movies' best in production design and narrative flourish. Not through any coincidence at all, the episode was picked up by the network to be submitted to award shows and film festivals.
This episode got accepted into the Annecy Animation Festival in France, and I think also a festival in Italy.
This one in Italy, the Pulcinella Award.
Pulcinella, that's right.
It got screened at Annecy, alongside a really diverse group of programs. I think the only other American program exhibited in the TV sector that year was As Told by Ginger, so as far as representation went, these two probably dovetailed off each other well and made for a pretty strong presence, you know. The episode was nominated and actually won a Pulcinella Award, a European designation stemming from a wider-reaching festival for animated content. Not only did the episode help deem the show the best TV show for teens and young adults, but it also gave the show itself the distinction of having the best group of characters of the year. For the former, it actually had to beat out picks like Clone High and Samurai Jack for its spot, which has to speak to how universal its essence was. Following in step with such a bombastic premiere, Season 3 is where home movies starts to hit its stride as home movies and adult animated comedy. To me, it seems like it's a crew favorite, and it probably is what they perceive to be their peak, and honestly, who would disagree with them, right? This was the genesis of a different show. A tighter, faster, looser, less homely home movies. If Season 2 is about finding your groove, Season 3 was about bringing the house down with it. Its serial identity, being a disjointed but raw look into a child's life, had morphed into some surrealist comedy of errors. It hadn't exactly lost its initial identity, but the way it chose to expand upon it had varying results. Usually positive, though. Seeing how the focus of the show had always been consistently Brendan, the tonal shifts of the show tend to coincide with his developments, with the previous season's relational arcs fizzling out and ending on a flat note. We've kind of landed on these new ones with rather looming uncertainty. Brendan's left flapping in the wind in terms of development, but he's compensating with all the wacky hijinks he'll get up to. The sets and locations expand to fit this. Everything around him becomes more loud and brash. Everyone gains a bit more edge to them. It's funny because the show itself internalized the amateur label that it was only supposed to encompass in theme. Now that it has a cinematic flair to it, it doesn't even lose its common edge. If anything, it becomes more relatable after the fact. It's kind of like Curb Your Enthusiasm now. I'm pretty sure you can conclude a few episodes with its signature sting and have it fit precisely.
Oh, Brendan, you're going to get it.
While this world doesn't age with any determinable or consistent indicator, it kind of grows the beard. Its integration of more abrupt crudity, absurdist elements, and unchecked cynicism perhaps speaks more to its then-current colleagues in adult animation, but it doesn't reflect as untrue to this world. The world of home movies was always a reflection of more realistic parts of it, whereas previously any real-life unpleasantries were met with a meek aside muttered to nobody in particular. Now, they'd be met with a more relatable, unrefined response.
I can't believe that you talked to me that way! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! I hate you!
It allowed its lens to react and readjust to the world around him in proportion to what's going on. Speaking of the lens, the movie's integration was also important to touch on. In Season 3, the movies became of slightly less relevance, whereas the previous season worked hard to keep them in focus. Oftentimes, this newer one would place them squarely in the background, if at all. They were too busy writing about Ren fairs and metal rock contests in order to squeeze them in all the time. Obviously, this does factor into how the series chooses to portray itself. In seasons previous, home movies made it very clear that Brendan being the focus made his work the centerpiece of his life. So all that time we had to focus on a movie mirroring the plot, or a plot based around the movie, was their way of signaling how far removed Brendan was from his outer surroundings. Like, he had good spatial awareness on paper, but that doesn't draw his interest to bring awareness to it. Now that he's got his head out in the clouds, He can have bigger and more grand adventures in varied settings. We can start to see everyone for who they are. Walter and Perry, for example, are more or less outed for the giggling degenerates that they always were in so many wonderful ways.
We want a naked sleepover.
Baby, what's your naked mom fan?
Shut up and leave me alone.
I think they make each other worse, and honestly, I'm all here for it. Jason and Melissa get equally fleshed out more. They slowly unravel to be a bit more explosively flawed, and for more grounded characters, they have some serious, quirks about them. The adults are mostly the same, but since McGurk has only had his status as accidental main character and fanbase grow in size exponentially, he has had as many more comical adventures as he does emotional. Home Movie Season 3 is one hell of a height to reach. It has some of the best music, the most exciting episodes, and the most fleshed out characters yet. The only thing that's left to figure out is what to do with these damn movies. Because despite being the title character, it's been credited as more of a guest cameo rather than the main role it desires. And that's not a situation that'll seem to improve as time goes on.
I've said this before, is having a cartoon is a lot like not having a cartoon. Nobody gives a Nobody gives a
Season 4 is very ambiguous. I don't even fully understand it as I'm relaying it to you. It's a bit of an enigma. The commentaries, as I'd only come to discover I had so close to finishing the script, doesn't seem to spoon-feed as many trivial facts that I could weave into a loose narrative, so I went into these pretty bone dry. I have to assume everyone was nothing but self-aware putting this one together. Season 3 was the ultimate party, and Season 4 was the ultimate hangover to match. The memories of the night will not be deterred, but you will still have to deal with the fallout of everything you've done. Before jumping into the course of the real story, we can run through a few other attributes. The animation, as far as I could see, didn't really progress in a notable way. I mean, Season 3 was all the technical achievement it needed, so it'd be fair to say they built on that just a little bit more. By then, the series had reached its peak in terms of general visual strength. It's not just a radio drama anymore. It's a real Adult Swim cartoon with the Hanna-Barbera budget. The characters are more or less the same as they'd be before. I think back in the day, many considered this the worst season because of its more conventional premises, I think. I don't really see it. Everyone was thrown into stories and settings they're more familiar seeing on Family Guy, but that's not at the detriment of the show. It had just evolved to the point and its pure growth didn't present any obvious problems to me. As a possible positive, everyone swears a bit less than they once did. The adult humor is definitely still there, but it takes some of the ruthless edge off.
Snap out of it! Ah! Now listen to me.
No! Ow!
You want another one?
Oh, no, please.
The music's still pretty good. No noticeable dip there.
Septipus! Septipus! Septipus!
Alright, let's finally tackle the movies. If you're of a keen eye, you might have noticed that the movies themselves have as consistent an arc as the people who put them together. They have certain ups and downs they've hit every season, and each time that output and contents typically match what the director's going through, indirectly or otherwise. In Season 1 they tended to meander and be kind of generic ideas. They're not trying too hard yet, they're just feeling things out. In Season 2, the writing and the general production design do ramp it up and present a more conventional, albeit still amateur approach. They become more integral to the happenings of the cast than ever, so a lot of inner meaning and depth leaks in. In Season 3, there were definitely fewer movies, but that same energetic spirit intensifies, resulting in more manic and chaotic productions. And in Season 4, the movies are slowly taken out of commission. Part of the way home movie starts to wrap itself up over time. Think about this. The films that Brendan makes are kind of considered as training wheels. The whole genesis of the show was set into motion because, as expressed outside of the show proper, his dad gave him this camcorder before he left, and it's occupied his life ever since. The movies are important, and they do signal some burgeoning interest in film and entertainment. Now, that being said, they are, socially speaking, a means to an end. Once the kid finds a purpose in chasing roadies or going to the zoo, these occupying objects merely become reflective of other events. When he grows up a little and really seizes upon something more adventurous, the films aren't more than a side thing. These projects are interconnected into everything, whether they're lauded as the award-winning cinema they often are, or derided as just more stupid little video films. He didn't just grow in and out of these movies. As we'd come to learn by this season, the movies grew within him. Not to say he'd gone through incredible trauma to get there, but there is a subtle reason why it's set up this way. So throughout the season, you'll notice that the movie's relevance for Brendan start to slip away, but their influence in the framework still remains. There are several episodes where film production gets sidetracked in a major way. In episode 6, the whole idea of the film has to be cleaned up after a raunchy comedy creates scandal among the neighborhood parents. In episode 8, many of the past archives get eaten by a hyperactive puppy in the midst of a mad dash to determine who owns him. In episode 3, they don't even make a movie. In episode 10, they do make a finished product, but if not for it being an accidental Chekhov's gun in the final few minutes, it probably wouldn't have been mentioned. It's clear that this time, while there's not as smooth a transition out of the concept of movie making, the way it's being resolved is definitely easing out of it. The final episode, Focus Grill, ironically throws this mandate back into focus. The episode, without hitting you initially, is a multi-layered series finale for everyone on board for the rest of the journey. The way I've seen it explained, I expected the more dramatic part of the story to be the focal point, but in reality, it's barely a lead-up to the final resolution. It all comes together perfectly regardless. The main trio is running their work through their newly assembled focus group and haven't found it going too well. So they decide to go into the archives and discover that their first film was still relatively unfinished. It had no ending. In trying to come up with a satisfying conclusion, they reach a metaphysical impasse with their work and are confronted with the reality they're thrust into. As a B-plot, McGurk has to set up the Smalls' new grill. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, initially, many would write off the events featured as an average adventure until the last few minutes or so, when to me it seems like it was set up from the beginning to involve the audience and get them ready for the end. If you couldn't guess, the focus group probably parrots a lot of similar critiques that have been heard before.
Lauren?
Yes?
Maybe you should try like one episode where you don't have a script. One of them.
Yeah, it's pretty much not...
Whether they're of merit or not doesn't really matter. They're halting production and they're killing morale. In essence, even if they're sound in a technical or narrative aspect, the movies are being criticized for being things they were never intended to represent. This has been the gang's way of life for years, presumably, and while not always the most glamorous activity to indulge in, it felt like they achieved a lot through it. What went wrong to put them in this position? Were they ever good? Was there ever any point? These questions aren't posed with any dramatic zeal, but to some extent prior to their final screening, these things have had to have crossed their minds. Obviously, they don't have any answers or solutions to these things. The only real one that exists is accepting that they don't know what lies ahead. I doubt this is a full mirror of the crew's relationship with the fans, but it'd be dishonest to pretend that it didn't represent at least part of it, intentionally or not.
So I guess, Lauren, you're in the PD camp and you agree that the show has deteriorated over the years?
No. It was supposed to get better, but I have heard people say that their favorite episodes are the earlier ones, and they seem to like the fact that it sounds most conversational.
When they actually have to sit back and assess their life's work, they're met with the impact of uncertainty. It's not pronounced, it's not soul-wrenching or heartbreaking. It just is. The three sit back and accept that maybe these were never good to begin with. Now, Home Movies has never been one to mince words. It's a show all about finding the spice in life in the most mundane of activities. It's unpolished, unpaced, unfunny at times. Yes, really. But it's just life. A lot of episodes end on a lopsided note. Plenty are comedic or emotionally satisfying, but a lot of them just end as if they reached the end of a page. The movies have never been a crutch or a shield or anything, just another way to see the world presented to us. They kind of help to hold Brendan's hand, but in that sense, I guess they also lead him into oncoming traffic just as well. They are as inconsistent a device as they are in topic and tone. That's probably the only consistent thing in them. And if you refuse to recognize that, well, let's just say it's time to pay the price.
It's time to pay the price. It is a time to pay the price.
The only thing more consistent than their present was the presence of this trio. Brendan, Jason, and Alyssa have probably been brought together through these movies, but in turn, it was never really about them, was it? I've been rambling about the former trying to find himself and how the movies are related to his social standing and blah blah blah, but secretly, it was all just a mask. By the beginning of the show, I think it's rather ambiguous where the friendship stands. Not that it's on the verge of collapse, but these are just a bunch of kids. You've seen real growth, real change since then, like a real evolution. Home Movies is not about flawless victories or endless sorrow. It's not about fighting the system within or exposing the noxious underbelly throughout. It's not about clawing your way to the top or plunging to the deepest depths. All of that stuff's for the real movies. All this is about is accepting what comes, and often what comes is nothing but the bare truth. You might go through any manner of such feat just trying to make it out there, but seeing this for how raw it really is means living in the moment. Absolutely. Those tapes you saved are not really reminding you of past memories, but they help ground you to the present. So long as you're ready to look ahead, you'll always find a small ounce of truth in the most lively of folly. All that matters is that you keep looking ahead.
This is gonna sound really weird, guys. I don't think our movies should be watched.
You shouldn't?
No.
Then why are we making them?
I have no idea why we make them. All I know is this. We keep coming here after school every single day, and we just keep doing it. And then, I don't know, and then we just do it, and I guess it feels like we should just be doing it, I guess. I don't know.
Weird. We are... God, we're weird.
What's wrong with us?
I don't know.
We're weirdos.
To say that Home Movies is a special animated series is unequivocally the greatest understatement of all time. Its rise, fall, and rise again is emblematic of TV animation's golden age potential on full display, and another ringing endorsement as to why adoption should always be the first choice. Its service to the sector would perhaps be eclipsed in a mainstream form of discussion by other cartoons that lived down much longer, more extravagant production cycles, but to many of us, it will always be remembered as the master director it is. The world of entertainment is weird like that. Not every famous director is equally famous. Some are peak mainstream acceptability, while others have a more grim or esoteric aesthetic only few work to truly understand. Home movies not only had a chance to evolve its processes, it got to grow up through its work. Like, it didn't make anyone rich, and it didn't fuel the Turner content farm indefinitely, but this was a real job to these guys. They didn't talk about it as such, but they learned a lot navigating this weird little pet project put on while Cartoon Network got up for a midnight snack. They got to make their piece relatively unfettered, which is as desirable and ideal as it gets for many animation fans. But more importantly, they got to make others' careers far off into the future. Its genesis is easily the basis for a ripple effect that is still making waves today. Home Movie's modest success not only helped pave the way for future series from Bouchard and Small, but it also helped heap credibility onto its intrepid studio soup to nuts. The New York-LA bubble accrued in animation is not being popped anytime soon, but having a Connecticut-based upstart engine being energized by this new production did show for itself. In a way, any other projects they took on were partially brought to life because this series went down so well. So you can thank this show for the intergalactic transfer from Lexicon. In the rest of the Bouchard tract, you can see a lot of the same tonal DNA. It's part of what makes Bob's Burgers the mild-mannered slam dunk it continues to be today. Even looking at the recent Apple Plus original Central Park, you can hear some Home Movies alum if you listen closely enough. As for Adult Swim and the rest of the Cartoon Network family, I think it panned out well. Sure, its success wasn't anything titanic like Aqua Teen Hunger Force or Robot Chicken, but I'd argue its influence put it on the map just as much. For many, it was quite literally the first thing that symbolized the iconic adult block. Its rapid developments and experimentation have long since earned it a cult status. But on a multifaceted level, having its success story in the ranks of the Cartoon Network family probably helped to justify whenever Adult Swim felt like rescuing more abandoned animated series. So, Futurama, Family Guy, Tuca and Birdie, they all owe Brendan a big one. Whatever creative integrity might have been called into question elsewhere on the channel was properly solidified through their treatment of this one. It's very much a favorite among many old and young in the field today, and in the most unexpected places you'll find allies to these characters. For something that I used to catch on at 2 a.m, it's quite satisfying to see it have its impact on people in my age bracket especially. I think it mirrors a lot of how we are now with what the crew went through making it. They have a weird synergy, and its wholesome understanding of the demure musings of an 8-year-old that happen to link up well with our old Zoomer musings. But all the while, I think it has a renewed sentiment in current year. I don't want to date this video too much, but obviously this year has been a hotbed of instability, hostility, and uncertainty. The feeling of meaninglessness and the lack of power is all anyone's been feeling. Everyone's still trying to find their way, while even folks that should be set have had their whole lives turned upside down. It's crazy out there. If there's any major takeaway, I'd hope that we could move forward with a zest for acceptance. Not everything's another push forward or another battle towards a victory. Shit just happens sometimes, and there's no accounting for this future. Especially in the next few months, plenty of folks will be confronted with the reality that things are not exactly going to run as planned, and it will have an innumerable effect. Taking everything in stride while also doing your due diligence is practically a martial art. It'd take years and years for us to even grasp onto another rung on that ladder. Things are not exactly going to dissolve and dissipate come New Year's Day, and that's more or less to be expected, but what worries me is the lack of expectation there is for what comes after. It's a challenge for us all, some more than others, can't afford to just tread water, but to accept our uncertainty would be a desirable step forward. Not with malice, nor bitterness, or hopelessness. In fact, it's one of the more optimistic feats we can accomplish as human beings. Far off into the future, we're not exactly going to find ourselves in ideal sorts at all points, and while most of us just do what we can, sometimes the best option we'll be left with is not to act going forward. Anytime you take a leap of faith, no matter the outcome, your feet will always find solid ground again. The only status quo we abide by is the advent of change. And while we're waiting for a change to rock the boat again, it'd be best for us to just accept it. That type of wisdom won't be echoed in time through film reels or literature. It only reaches you if you've officially hung on for the ride.